Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon.
And my name is John Henry. And it's good to have you in our listening audience once again tonight as we continue our study from the book of Numbers. Tonight we'll begin studying chapter 24. And of course, we've been talking about Balaam and Balak.
And John, we have been talking about how Balak wants Balaam to curse Israel. And every time when he speaks, he ends up blessing them, because Balaam told Balak he can only say what God has put into his mouth. And that's exactly what goes on. Like we talked about in chapter 23, where Balaam is taken to another place by Balak so that he would see the people and perhaps curse the people. But instead, he speaks of God, and then he also speaks of how Israel, that God doesn't see any fault in Israel and the relationship that they're having. And so this is making Balak furious, because he wants him to curse these folks, because he knows of the acts that Israel had done under God's guidance, of how victorious they were. And he saw this as a threat. And indeed, they would be, especially if they do not recognize the true and living God. And so here they have their own religion, as how they have things set up, and they were not willing to bow to the God of Israel. And so here you have this clash.
But they was willing to bow down to Baal.
Yes, exactly.
And that was one thing, of course, God did not put up with, and it was one of the things in the Ten Commandments: thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Right.
And then we've also read that God is a jealous God.
Yes.
And, he took them for his peculiar people for his own possession, to serve him and to worship him the way he prescribed. And then then here they meet, some of these, of course, they've been warned about, when they get up around the promised land and going into the promised land, God had warned them, don't try to participate in the nations, their pagan religions. You're going to see a lot of different things, but stay away from it.
Right.
Continue to, be faithful to me. And the same thing is true today, I believe. We see a lot of different religions. And sometimes we ask the question, well, why do so many religions exist? Well, we could compare that to the Old Testament. It's simply because men stopped serving God the way God commanded. And then men have devised their own plan or scheme of worship. And so that's how they worship God today, according to their own desires, their fleshly desires, so it's completely wrong. And, through the Old Testament, I think that's one of the things that we can learn. We have to worship God as he prescribes in no other way, or, God is going to be he is highly upset when we don't do what he asks of us.
Right. And that's, again, that's a very stark warning for all of us as we're looking at these historical events that are taking place here. And remember, Balaam, as we mentioned on other occasions, is described as really what he was seeking is the wages that Balak promised him if he were to curse Israel. And so Balaam is basically doing all that he can to try to get those riches that was promised to him, and yet he can only say what God has put in his mouth. So he's failing to accomplish Balak's order or request here.
And all he's able to do is keep blessing the people, which keeps aggravating Balak. And to the point there at the end of verse 23, basically, I think he's saying here in verse 25, Balak said unto him, neither curse them at all, nor bless them at all. And it's like, well, if you're not going to curse them, you're not going to bless them, then just be quiet.
Right, exactly.
That's kind of the impression that I kind of get. Just don't say nothing.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's because, he's really upset at what's going on here because, like you said, he called him there to curse, and nothing's going on. He's not giving Balak any help whatsoever.
And then when we got into chapter 24, we were taught just a little bit about this, John, in our last session that we had here. And what Balaam does, again, he is taken to another place to view Israel, and perhaps that he might curse. But then it's interesting that in verse 1 of 24, you have when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to speak omens, but he set his face toward the wilderness. In other words, what would happen is they would set the altars up, and then Balak would stand by the altar while Balaam would go away from there, and then God would put into his mouth what to say. And then now this situation is a little bit different, and that's what we're seeing in this concerning what Balaam would be saying concerning Israel and God. Go ahead. Yes.
Well, I was going to say this time, as you said in verse 1, he's not going to step away.
Right.
He simply turns his face toward the wilderness because he begins to understand, what God desires.
Right. Yes.
And of course, that's very commendable. But as we're going to see here, it's not going to last.
Right. Yeah, and again, it's describing the blessings of Israel in their connection to God.
Right.
And you could see this, for example, when you look at the verse 5, how fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel, like valleys that stretch out like gardens beside the river. And when you think about a garden beside a river, what does that say? It is well nourished, well watered, and thriving, just is green and lush. And this is how Israel is described here concerning that relationship. Like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the water, strong and sturdy, that kind of imagery that's given there. Water will flow from his buckets, and his seed will be by many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. And so here you see the ruling position that Israel is going to be in as well because of this relationship with God. So no wonder when God put into the mouth of Balaam to where Balak expecting Israel to be cursed, he points out the blessing. And notice that the blessings that they have. And that is as Balak is hearing this, not only is he frustrated, but he also is gaining fear because of what it...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
because he can begin to see the writing on the wall.
Absolutely.
This phrase here in verse 7, yes. He says, and his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted, seems to be not just talking about the kings of Israel, but pointing towards the Messiah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I believe that there is some messianic prophecy in there at this particular point.
Right.
And so I thought that to be interesting.
Right.
And then in verse 8 it said, God brought him forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. He shall eat up the nation, his enemies, and shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. And that goes along with what you just said about, him, Balak, being able to see basically the writing on the wall, and he's getting more and more afraid, like you said, because, and then I would suppose if you were standing there and heard something like this come out of Balaam's mouth, that would begin to really,
right, absolutely,
I think really, to get to a person. And he goes on in verse 9 and says, he he lay down as a lion, and as a great lion, who shall stir him up? Blessed is he that blesseth thee, and cursed is he that curseth thee. And so here it seems as, Israel's going to have the strength of oxen or an ox, and would consume all the enemy nations. Because he points out, he would break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. And so that would symbolize that. And then the idea of a lion. Well, anybody that sees, if you was out in the wilderness or somewhere in the jungle and you'd happen to come upon a lion laying there, you would not want to bother it.
Right. Exactly.
You would leave it go and try to get away from it.
Yes.
And so that's what's being pointed out here. But Israel is going to arise like a great lion. And again, it goes to show, as we've been talking about, the destruction of these different nations.
That's right.
That are there. Because you remember, when we go back to Abraham, God told Abraham basically that those people would be in captivity, and when he brought them forth, that those nations that were in the promised land, he would use Israel to judge them.
Absolutely.
And so this is what we have right here, part of that prophecy of Abraham. We're starting to see that, I think, unfold, Albert.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, all the promises that God made to Abraham back in Genesis 12 beginning, and then you start to see it again in 22. Well, you see it earlier too as well. So you have and God pointing those things out of the promise he made, and especially those who bless you and will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. And the idea really is the rejection. The idea, if you reject those things of Abraham, and especially with Abraham's faith in God, that means you're rejecting God. And so that means you're not going to be blessed. You're going to be destroyed. In other words, you have cursed those things. And I think a very good point that you brought up here in the 24 concerning the messianic promises. You could see all of that, which the promise that God made to Abraham. Yes, the immediate fulfillment of that is the nation of Israel. But the ultimate fulfillment would be the Christ. And this is the same thing here. You have, as you pointed out, very well pointed out, John, you have the immediate fulfillment is Israel conquering those nations and taking captive of the land. But the ultimate fulfillment is in the ultimate king that was to come through the line of Judah.
I think maybe a good way to look at this is that, when God spoke to Abraham, he promised they would be a great nation. Right. So they were in Egypt for 430 years, and during that time they became this great nation. Yes, they did. If you figure up the number of people that left, we can get just a kind of round figure of probably at least 5 million people. Right. Well, as these people come out, this is God's nation. So that's the first promise fulfilled to Abraham. The second one is that there would be land. And so this is where we're at now. Now they're going to go in and take the land. Right. And then when he talks about here about, talking about Israel's king shall be higher than Agag, with a look towards the Messianic, that through Abraham's seed all the nations. And so you begin to see first promise, second promise, third promise. Once they get the land, and then they wait for the Messiah, the great King, the anointed one of God. Right. And so it's when you put that, to me, it's a little bit easier, I guess, maybe. Right. But you can see that real easy. Absolutely. Boom, 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 and then
Absolutely. So, and again, like we have these mile markers throughout the scriptures, right, as you're headed towards really looking at the New Testament and the plan of redeeming man being fulfilled. So, but you have the markers along the way, that you're on the right track. Sort of the idea of traveling or this journey that we are on. And then it continues in this, John, as you look at verses 10 through 14. Again, Balak is angry again. And in fact, you can see it says he even struck his hands together. And Balak said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies, but behold, you have persisted in blessing them these 3 times. I mean, you could see the anger. Yeah, you can see him how.
And when he smacks his hands together, you can just see that.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, this guy was boiling over by now. He'd reached the boiling point, so to speak.
And then what Balaam does is, I told you, he's reminding Balak of what he said. He said, did I not tell your messengers whom you had sent to me, saying, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything contrary to the command of the Lord, either good or bad, of my own accord. What the Lord speaks, that I will speak. And so Balaam is telling Balak, I told you about this before I even came. And I imagine, John, along with that by Balaam coming and doing what he did, gave Balak hope. Mm-hmm. And so it was a false hope, even though Balaam had warned Balak about that. And so a lot of times, you tell people the truth, and they are just so heart bent on getting their way.
Right.
And any little action towards thinking that what they want is going to be done, even though you've warned them, it just sets them in a frenzy.
Right.
When it comes to those kinds of things. And so you see that happening here with Balaam.
One of the things, before we go any farther,
sure.
In verse 11, after he tells him in verse 10, his anger began to boil. Now look at verse 11, the very first part said, therefore now flee thou to thy place. And so my understanding of that, he's saying, well, you can go home now. Mm-hmm. You've not done nothing for me. Right. And he also points out, I thought to promote thee. In other words, he's saying, the Lord, the God that's telling you these things, has caused you to lose the reward.
Right.
You lose all, the money. No reward for this soothsayer. That's what he's saying. Yeah. Nothing for you, And then he goes on, like you said, and Balaam said unto Balak, basically in 12 and 13, just to sum up what you said, didn't I tell you before I came, I sent word that God, and anything that I spoke was going to be a blessing, that I could not curse God's people.
Yeah, and as you mentioned that, John, the New American Standard reads that it says, behold, the Lord has held you back from honor.
Right.
I want us to think about that for a moment. How often people have thought that following God's instruction holds you back from worldly gain. And what do people do? Well, if that's holding me back, those principles of morality, those principles of conduct, is building your character, people throw that away in order to obtain the world's riches.
Right.
Because in their mind, they have been deceived into thinking that God is holding them back from those things. And that is far from the truth. Right. In fact, God is showing you the best way, the best way to be honored and to gain. And especially if you don't have the monetary things of this life, if you have God, you have all that you need. But so many people are deceived into thinking that way. And this is what Balak tells Balaam. And we'll see later on that had a tremendous impact on Balaam as well, with that statement. And so how often people are deceived into thinking that following God's commands, God's instructions on the way of life, they believe that it's holding you, that you're being deceived and thinking that it's holding you back. No, it's not. Mm-hmm. In fact, you are way ahead when you follow God's will.
You know, that's an excellent point that you just made there. And so many times you might even hear in talking with a person or conversing with a person, you might even hear something like that expressed to you.
Absolutely.
To the fact that, well, you know, because I'm a Christian, you know, God says I can't do this, this, this. But like you said, the point is, it's not that we can't have earthly wealth. God never said that we couldn't have things. The thing of it is how you go about possessing them.
That's right.
And a lot of times, you know, people look at things, what they want to do is take a shortcut.
Right.
And the shortcut is doing things that are dishonest.
Right.
Unbecoming of a Christian, and you know, doing things that God would not approve of.
Right.
And so what people need to do is kind of reverse their thought a little bit. You know, now like you said, now if I do what God wants me to, God can bless me. Well, we don't think of that.
Right. Yes.
But look how he blessed the people in the Old Testament through when they done what God said. There were blessings. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament there, I recall that maybe you can help me. I don't remember if it's in Colossians or where, but you know, God talked about blessing people, and he said, you know, that the blessings that he can give us will overflow.
Right. Yeah.
But the thing of it is that comes through our allegiance and loyalty to God and doing what he says. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to live in $1 million mansion.
Right.
That's not what that means. But, you know, if we'll do what God says and listen to him, you know, God will bestow his blessings upon us.
Absolutely.
But like you said, you know, the greatest blessing is to know that you're a child of God.
Absolutely.
Regardless of what you have in life. So, yeah, that's a great point that you made there.
Yeah, the familiar phrase is people sell their souls.
They
sell their souls. I hear.
That's a good point. You're so right. People sell their souls, and that's basically what Balaam's going to do here in a few minutes.
Right.
Kind of when we get down through here.
Yeah.
So,
and I have then what Balaam does do is he says, I'm going to advise you what this people will do to your people in the days to come. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be a motivator for Balak, even more so when he tells them these things in the next few verses concerning that situation. So it's a very thing that we need to keep in mind as we look at these things developed here.
And then in verses 15 and 16, I think he begins to talk about this even more in depth. Mm-hmm. He says, and he took up his parable, and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, and the man whose eyes were open hath said, he hath said, which heard the words of God, and knew the knowledge of the Most High, which saw the vision of the Almighty, falling into a trance, but having his eyes open, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy the children of Seth, it says there. Like you said in verse 14, he says, I will advertise or tell thee what this people will do. Then he takes up this parable once again, and he begins to speak this parable about the Son of God. But then the parable is not good, because as you read it, what do we see? Well, again, when we get down to verse 17, he says, there shall come a star out of Jacob and a scepter. Now, those two words definitely point to, once again, the Messiah, because Hebrews 1, as you begin reading the book of Hebrews in 1, it talks, God said that he would rule and with the scepter of his kingdom. So that tells us, this indicates that we're talking about the Messiah.
Absolutely.
And then the star, of course, is something, the star, as I recall, refers to royalty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now you've got royalty and the scepter. You've got the king with the scepter, which points to the Son of God, but still the prophecy is not very good. Of course, he does arise out of Israel, like we talked about, but Moab's going to be destroyed.
Yes.
Because of all that.
And you can see, you can clearly see the power that's being possessed by the one with the scepter, the star, and then even as he talks about, crushing through the forehead, as the New American Standard says, of Moab. So that's telling you, again, Moab's defeat. And you do see that in the actions, in the wars, as Israel is taking possession of the land. And you see, again, as it refers back to that. But the ultimate fulfillment, as you well stated, John, and making it easier, that when they possess the land in the Messiah, the one whom God has promised, he comes. And he is, as we will see later on in many of the prophecies, talking about establishing his kingdom. His reign will be forever. And notice, as you further go down to verse 18, Edom shall be a possession. Seir, its enemy, also will be a possession, while Israel performs valiantly. And one from Jacob shall have dominion and will destroy the remnant from the city. And he looked at Amalek and took up his discourse and said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his end shall be destruction. So again, defeat after defeat as Israel is being established, and in particular, the ultimate king ruling and reigning through Christ Jesus.
And so it seems like Edom and Moab are going to be the first ones that are going to be destroyed. Moab means all the sons of confusion. The Moabites are to be understood as men of warlike or confusion, I find. Edom, of course, was Moab's southern neighbor. And then he talked about Edom and Seir. They are Israel's enemies also. They're going to be conquered by a king who would arise out of Israel. Of course, we should make mention, of course, that you had Saul, then David, and Solomon.
Right.
But those eventually led to the Messiah, the coming of Christ.
Right.
There.
So again, he's just pointing out to the outcome, and really whatever Balak does from here on out to try to stop it, it will not prevent it. It may slow it, in other words, push it out a little further, but it's not going to stop what God is saying through Balaam and what's being pointed out about their future.
It seems in verse 19 when he says, out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion and shall destroy him that remaineth of the city, that the Israelites are going to go from city to city, and that if there's any of these Moabites, wherever they might be, they're going to be hunted down and destroyed because of their wickedness. And then in verse 20 he talks about Amalek, and they were the first heathen nation, as you recall, to rise against Israel when they were coming up out of the Egyptian bondage, according to Exodus 17 and verse 8. And God was going to punish them forever, according to 1 Chronicles 4 and verse 43. And then he goes on and he says, and he looked on the Kenites and took up this parable and said, Strong is thy dwelling place, and thou puttest thy nest in a rock. Nevertheless, the Kenites shall be wasted, until Asher shall carry thee away captive. And he took up this parable and said, Alas, who shall live when God doth this? And ships shall come from the coast of Chittim, and shall afflict Asher, and shall afflict Eber, and he also shall perish forever. And Balaam rose up, and went and returned to his place. And Balak also went his way. And so it kind of concludes with even more of those nations that were going to be destroyed because of their wickedness.
You got a history lesson summed up, or a future of what's going to happen here, and it's a bleak one for those who would be in opposition to Israel, and that's what you see, and ultimately those who would be in opposition to the ultimate King in Christ Jesus. Well, my friends, we're out of time, and we are certainly glad that you joined us, and we encourage you to join us again next Thursday as we continue our journey on looking at the plan of redemption and how it all comes about as we look at the history. But in the meantime, may God bless you as you continue to study His Word.